or?
Well, they can teach us, but we have to make certain, that they're, teachers rather than pranksters or, kind of bad things too. So, you have to have, certain criteria, before you start, taking, their word. I guess, taking into account their advice. So that, kind of, gets into the whole kind of a cult paranormal thing. Do you speak to these entities? Do you ask them questions? Do you follow their advice? How much, do you pay attention to them? Yeah, and, that's a whole different kettle of fish. Within, the biblical or, the Jewish or, the Christian, worldviews, there are angels and, there are demons. You have to be, fairly sophisticated spiritually to be able, to distinguish, like among spiritual entities as, to their nature and, to their veracity and, to their trustworthiness.
What their intent is. You have to know what their intent is.
Well, yeah. Well, and you also have to be able to, to discern within yourself your reaction, to them. Like, do you trust them or, do you not?
Wow. Changing the topic just a little bit. Sorry about that. Here's another email question that we have from a listener. P in Wisconsin writes, Dear Dr. Strassman, I have panic attacks after smoking DMT. Why do you think this is, and is it due to a dosage problem or a state of mind? And is this a normal reaction that you experienced with any of your volunteers in your study?
Yeah. One of our earliest volunteers that we overdosed on with DMT, and we subsequently lowered the dose after his experience. So he had some panic attacks after his big DMT experience. Those resolved over time, and he continued in the DMT study and kind of worked it through, and didn't have any panic attacks after that.
Do you think that could be a result of the vasopressin or other hormones that are released while you're doing it?
Well, I think it's more of a result of the psychological trauma of just an overwhelming experience. Oftentimes panic attacks that are not drug related can begin in response to some kind of psychological kind of trauma, like a car accident or being injured or being mugged, those kinds of things. In a comparable sort of way, I think that the psychological trauma that can come about from an unexpected DMT experience also, especially in somebody who might be biologically or psychologically, prone to anxiety, to develop, panic attacks, thereafter.
What was some of the most profound experiences that your subjects reported, and what was some of the heaviest doses that you injected, and what was the results of those?
Yeah, actually, the first couple of people, that we gave DMT to, we gave it intramuscularly, and that was just a bit too slow and wasn't as intense as the smoked effect. And because our studies were being, funded by the National Institute on Drug Abuse, I was, kind of keen on, reproducing the time course and the intensity that people were reporting when they were smoking it in the field. So then we switched over, to giving it intravenously, and we gave people, two people, too high a dose of intravenous DMT. That was 0.6 milligrams per kilogram. So we ended up, giving, the rest of the volunteers as the high dose, 0.4 milligrams per kilogram of intravenous DMT. And also this was DMT fumarate. It was a, water-soluble salt of DMT. Most of the time what's smoked on the street is the free base of DMT. So that isn't quite comparable on a milligram per milligram, basis to the fumarate salt of DMT that we were giving. Our small doses of DMT were 0.05 milligrams per kilogram and 0.1 milligrams per kilogram. And also we gave a couple of intermediate doses, 0.2 and 0.3 milligrams per kilogram. The most profound experiences, I suppose it just depends on what you mean by profound. Some people had, deep psychological healing in response to, some of the bigger doses of DMT, without, much in, the way of, visions or spiritual effects. Some people had spiritual enlightenment, kinds of experiences, merging into the white light, being reborn. People had entity contact with outer space beings and, communicated with them and helped them out. So there's a whole, gamut of incredibly moving and, profound responses, that people had. You have to read the book.
Oh, yes. We've read The Spirit Molecule several times, but I do see one that we haven't read yet, Inner Paths to Outer Space. Can you tell us a little bit about the context of that?
Yeah, that came out, I guess, about a year and a half ago now. It was the brainstorm of, the second author, who is a hematologist oncology researcher for Big Pharma, who's also a science fiction illustrator and writer and, big-time enthusiast. So he, contacted me after, reading, the DMT book and was quite keen on, getting the sci-fi community up to speed with our DMT work because of, his belief that quite a bit of the material in the DMT book would be of interest to these, science, fiction reading community out there. So it was his idea, and he asked me if I'd be interested, and I said for sure. And, then I asked, Luis Eduardo Luna, who's an anthropologist with a huge amount of ayahuasca experience, if he would come on board as well. So he agreed, and, then he asked his friend, Edie Frexa, who's a Hungarian psychiatrist with all kinds of great ideas about, quantum mind and non-locality, those kinds of things. So he did too. So the four of us collaborated. Each of us contributes 3 to 4 different chapters. I would say it's an elaboration and an explication of kind of the other worlds idea, the beings out there, where do they reside, what's the nature of, the information in those states, like how, can we understand it, from the point of view of both anthropology and, brain chemistry, quantum theory. So we kind of expand on, that, particular, theme, that came out in the DMT book.
And what are you working on currently? Is there any new books in the process?
Yeah, I'm working on a book about Old Testament prophecy and endogenous, psychedelics, which is, going to be kind of a hard sell, but, I've been studying the Old Testament for 15 years, thereabouts, since completing the DMT work. I couldn't quite, feel satisfied with the kinds of, models that I had approached, the DMT study with in the first place, the Buddhist or, the brain chemistry or, the psychodynamics, psychoanalytic. So I started looking for, models of spirituality that were more relational, that kind of, held, to the idea, that the spiritual realms exist and, they're external to us, rather than internal to us. And, the Old Testament model is, that kind of model. It's, like a relational model of spirituality. And the highest state of spiritual attainment in the Old Testament is the prophetic state. There's all kinds of visions and out of body experiences and contact with beings and all manner of psychedelic phenomena.
Well, the Guardian in the UK released an article last year about the possibility of Moses being under the influence of some sort of psychedelic whenever he wrote the Ten Commandments.
I think they mentioned ayahuasca by name.
And they mentioned ayahuasca by name in relation to acacia trees.
The burning bush, might have been an acacia tree. Well, yeah, a scholarly colleague of mine in Israel wrote an article. And so that's what the UK article was about. Well, so his name is, Benny Shannon.
Shannon.
And so he's at the Hebrew University in Jerusalem. Yeah. Well,